Between 1750 and 1850, the punishment of crime in Britain changed radically. Using the records from the courts, parliamentary papers and contemporary comment, this programme traces how and why that change came about.
On Wednesday last, at about 12 o'clock, Thomas Bolter and James Caldwell, the two highwaymen convicted at our last assizes, were conveyed to the place of execution. Bolter behaved remarkably penitent. He appeared greatly affected by his approaching fate. He prayed very earnestly and appeared to have due sense of the sad end which his offences had brought upon him. Caldwell was much more hardened. He looked round the spectators with singular confidence, and when approaching nearer the place of execution, he seemed to look at it attentively for a considerable time. They were both in the 23rd year of their age, and after hanging for the usual time, were taken down and buried.
Joseph Wood and Thomas Underwood were executed for robbing another boy. All the parties in this case were mere children, the malefactors being 14 years of age each, and the prosecutor no more than 12. The judge declared that it was necessary for the public safety to cut them off, in order that other boys might learn that their tender age would not save them. They were executed at Newgate on the 6th of July, 1791, apparently insensible of their dreadful fate.
Two accounts of hangings from the 18th century. The reports show what it was believed at the time that public hanging would achieve.
Bolter behaved remarkably penitent.
Those who were hanged were supposed to show how sorry they were for their crime.
It was necessary to cut them off, in order that other boys might learn.
And they were to be an example to others to discourage them from committing crime. Under the laws of the 18th century, a long list of crimes were capital offences. They could be punished by hanging.
Stealing, by day or night, of linen, fustians, calicos or cotton goods from the place of manufacture.
Making, forging or counterfeiting any deed, will, testament or bond with intent to defraud.
As industry and trade expanded in the 18th century, manufacturers wanted their property protected, and there was more opportunity for fraud and forgery.
Feloniously driving away or otherwise stealing one or more sheep, cows, oxen, steers, bullocks, heifers, calves or lambs.
Pickpocketing for 1 shilling or over.
Stealing fish out of any river or pond.
Cutting down growing trees.
Between 1805 and 1818, more than half of those hanged were executed for property crimes, burglary, robbery, stealing animals and forgery.
It is the judgment of this court that you be taken from this place to the place from whence you came, and then to a place of execution, there to be hanged by the neck until you are dead. And may God have mercy on your soul.
Since hanging was the penalty for so many crimes, were many offenders hanged? In the 1750s, the writer Joseph Massey observed,
"The penalties now laid down are more severe than people desire to have inflicted on pilfering thefts. They choose to put up with the loss of a few fish and fowls rather than press charges."
Sometimes the victims of crime would not press charges for theft because they knew it was possible the offender would hang. For the same reason, if a case came to court, juries did not want to convict the offender. The judge and author Henry Fielding noticed that juries preferred to find offenders innocent, as a guilty verdict might condemn them to hang. He also observed how often those sentenced to hang were pardoned. The statistics support his view. The chances of hanging varied according to the crime. In the years between 1749 and 1771, 3 out of 4 of those sentenced to death at the Old Bailey for forgery were hanged. But only 1 out of 4 of those sentenced to death for stealing horses was hanged. If they weren't hanged, what did happen to them?
Sarah Bellamy. Occupation servant. Indicted 9th of July 1785 for stealing in the dwelling house of Benjamin Aidan. Guilty. Transported for 7 years.
John Williams, no trade. Indicted August 18th, 1783, for breaking and entering the dwelling house of George Gape. Guilty. Sentenced to be hanged. Reprieved. Transported for 7 years.
Matthew Everingham. Occupation, clock. Indicted 7th of July, 1784, for falsely obtaining books, value 10 shillings. Guilty. Transported for 7 years.
Elizabeth Hervey, no trade. Indicted the 23rd of March 1784 for breaking and entering the dwelling house of William Furman. Guilty. Sentenced to be hanged. Reprieved. Transported for 14 years.
Elizabeth Hervey, Matthew Everingham, John Williams and Sarah Bellamy were among the more than 700 offenders aboard the ships of the First Fleet of Convicts transported to Australia. It sailed on the 13th of May 1787 for Botany Bay. Until the War of Independence, convicts had been transported to America. Transported convicts were those whose crimes were serious, but not serious enough to be hanged. They were sent somewhere they could not be a danger to society. On arrival, they were employed on building works, founding the settlement, or in cultivating the land for food. The fate which awaited individual convicts differed dramatically.
Sarah Bellamy and Matthew Everingham completed their sentences. They married other convicts and became settlers in Australia. They both had children and farmed the land.
Matthew Everingham wrote to his old employer Samuel Shepherd in October 1792. On the 7th of July last, my time expired. I have now settled 15 months, and my little farm, thank God, seems to promise pretty well. I have 5 acres of Indian corn, 1 of English wheat, about half an acre of barley, pumpkins and melons in abundance.
Elizabeth Hervey and John Williams both survived the voyage to Australia.
And both died, only months after they arrived.
An offender who wasn't transported might instead serve time doing hard labour on the prison ships, raising sand and gravel from the riverbeds. The hulks, as they were called, were originally a temporary measure, a place to send offenders in the 1770s while transportation to America was suspended during the War of Independence. In fact, they were used as prisons for 80 years. Louis Garneray spent 9 years on prison ships, not as an offender, but as a prisoner of war during the French Wars. Later, he wrote an account of his time there.
I can still remember vividly my dismay at first sight of the Portée, as she lay at anchor in line with 8 other prison ships in North Portchester River. The gun deck and the orlop deck were used to lodge the prisoners. Each of them must have been 130 feet long and 40 feet wide, and there were 700 of us down there. I cannot bring myself to describe the feelings of disgust and nausea which assailed me when I went down to the 24-pound deck to which I had been posted. I felt a thick, stifling fog choking me. The deck was pitch dark, but a miserable half-light crept in through some of the portholes, reaching the pale, cadaverous faces of the prisoners. Picture an army of corpses emerging from the grave, hollow-eyed, bent, their faces wan and grey, their bones half covered with yellow rags.
It's estimated something like 1 in every 3 offenders imprisoned on the hulks died there. As the 19th century began, hanging, transportation and hard labour on the hulks could all be used to punish serious crimes. But by the 1850s, only acts of treason or murder were hanging offences. Few offenders were transported anymore, and the temporary prison ships were finally abandoned. What caused the change? There were problems with both hanging and transportation. Offenders who were hanged were supposed to show sorrow. Many did. Stephen Gardiner was executed for burglary. He dressed in his death shroud and warned the crowd to avoid his mistakes. Others, like highwayman Jack Rann, pretended not to care in order to die game, as they called it. He dressed up for his hanging and remained defiantly cheerful to the end. This gave the crowd the wrong kind of lesson. The behaviour of the crowd itself was also a problem. An observer in the 1780s wrote,
"Hanging crowds have the appearance of a fair or merrymaking. This tends greatly to defeat the end of the punishment."
Some people began to doubt that the spectacle of the hanging did discourage crime. They were influenced by the ideas of the Italian philosopher Beccaria. He wrote,
"Crimes are more effectually prevented by the certainty of punishment."
Hanging was not certain. By the 1820s, 95% of those sentenced to death were pardoned. Transportation, too, had its problems. It was expensive. Between 1810 and 1812, it cost £570,000, the equivalent today of £16 million. On top of this, by the 1830s, Australia no longer wanted to receive Britain's offenders. As hanging and transportation declined, prison sentences increased. Prisons had always existed. Every town had its lockup, every county its jail. But they were used mainly to punish petty crimes or to hold offenders waiting to be hanged or transported. They were privately run and in a terrible condition. When the reformer John Howard investigated them in the 1770s, he found
loathsome cells. Prisoners confined together, men and women. Criminals half-starved. Pestilential fevers.
Nevertheless, more and more offenders were confined in them. There was much discussion of how they should be treated during the sentence. There was disagreement on the purpose of prison. Was prison to redeem offenders? To help them not to offend again by teaching them religion and useful skills? Or was prison to punish offenders, to teach them the lesson that crime leads to pain? In 1818, a House of Commons Select Committee investigated Newgate and the other prisons in London. One of those who gave evidence was Elizabeth Fry.
When was it you first established a committee of ladies to visit the female prisoners?
It is rather more than a year since I first established a school for the children of convicts. I did not undertake the care of the convicts in general until about 2 months afterwards. We assembled our women, read over our rules, brought them work, knitting and other things. And our institution commenced. It has now been about 10 months. They knit from about 60 to 100 pair of stockings and socks every month. They spin a little. The earnings of their work is generally spent in assisting them to live and helping to clothe them. It is our habit constantly to read the Bible to them. It has been very satisfactory to observe the effect upon their minds.
Do you think that any reformation can be achieved without employment?
I should believe it impossible. If they have nothing to do, they naturally must return to their evil practices.
What reward or hope of reward do you hold out?
Rewards form one part of our plan. We endeavour to stimulate them by a system of marks. If they have a certain number at the end of a fixed period, they have as rewards such prizes as we think proper to give them. Small articles of clothing, Bibles or Testaments. In a prison under proper regulations, where they were sufficiently well fed and clothed, constantly employed and instructed, I have not the least doubt that many of those now the worst characters would turn out valuable members of society.
Mrs. Fry's evidence shows which side of the argument on the purpose of prison she supported.
Our habit is constantly to read the Bible to them.
She believes prisoners should receive religious instruction.
They knit, they spin a little.
She believes they should be given some work to do.
Rewards form one part of our plan.
She believes in giving rewards for good behaviour.
I have not the least doubt that many of those now the worst of characters would turn out valuable members of society.
She believes that the purpose of prison should be to make it possible for the prisoners to rejoin society. Did the prison system develop as reformers like Mrs. Fry hoped? New prisons were established, the convict prisons called penitentiaries. On arrival, prisoners were washed, their heads shaved, and they were given numbers, uniforms and masks. This was to show they were making a new start. They were to spend time alone in separate cells to think about their crime. At first sight, this looks like exactly what reformers like Mrs. Fry wanted. But in a letter in 1843, she wrote about Pentonville Prison, "The dark cells should never exist in a Christian and civilized country. Even the sight of the sky is precluded. I think a prison for separate confinement should be constructed that the culprits may at least see the sky." For the first 18 months of their sentence, prisoners were locked up completely alone to think about their life and crimes. Mrs. Fry said, "I am certain that separate confinement induces an unhealthy state of mind." She was right. 20 months of isolation, prisoners suffered mental breakdowns, some committed suicide. But the influence of reformers like Mrs. Fry was in decline. Fear of crime was growing, particularly among the prosperous middle class who found themselves living in crowded towns, close to people who were often very poor and people who did not necessarily obey the law. These dangerous classes, as they were called, were seen as people needing to be punished, not deemed. An inquiry into prison discipline decided that prison was not sufficiently dreaded. New laws introduced changes. Prisoners were not to spend their time alone in thought, but in monotonous, unproductive tasks like turning the crank handle or walking on the treadmill. Prisons were not to be places of redemption, but of hard fare, hard labour, hard bed. Between 1750 and 1850, the punishment of crime in Britain changed dramatically. Imprisonment took over as the main punishment for serious crime. But in the prisons of the mid-19th century, little remained of the early reformers' ideas of redemption. It's debatable whether the system of hard fare, hard labour, hard bed was any more humane than that of 100 years before.